Well, I'm going to bring you a little bit different perspective of what GIS is about. Some of it will certainly complement what Christian Carlson talked to you about and what your own experience has been. But I want to help you see it through the lens or the eyes of somebody who's in a, let's say, a senior executive position. And it's not necessarily a governor, although I'll bring some of that to you. I've been also senior executive in the private sector too, so I might try to merge some of that in. But highlighting the conference theme again, informing conversations and building partnerships. I think it's a great way to approach this conference. I did speak to a SWUG group, come to think of it, a few years ago. When was it in Jackson Hole? 2003? Was that when I spoke up there? And I ran my own demo. And it blew Mark Schaefer away. Mark was the head of USGS, I think, at the time, or the acting director. And he says, "How did you do that?" I said, "It was totally bluff, I'll tell you." But one of the first conclusions I would draw from my experience in using GIS is it's more than a map. I relate the story of when I went out to Redlands one time shortly after joining Esri, and I had time to get a haircut early in the morning, so I found a barber shop that was open. Took my turn, and the guy says, "Do you have business here in town?" And I said, "Yeah." He says, "What kind of business?" And I said, "Well, it's with Esri, the software company." And he says, "Oh yeah, that's that map stuff, isn't it?" And I thought, you know, that's a pretty common thing. Have you ever tried to explain GIS to your mother or your wife or your husband or kids? You know, today it's probably a lot easier than it was when I first became acquainted with it, because if you can ask the kids especially, can you find a location on your phone? Immediately you know you got a link right away because it's location-based information. So you relate it to something they can talk about. Use the language they understand. Well, I can't resist the temptation to at least put this map up one more time. Several of you have probably already seen it. This was one of the first things I asked the Department of Administration for, probably my first year in office. I said, why can't we have a map that shows the relative size of the cities by the populations that are there? And after a little bit of thinking back and forth, we came up with this idea of spreading the population. One dot equals one person on this map. How many states can do that? Not very many, right? We're a state of, well, you can see, if I didn't bring my laser pointer, but here we are in the thriving metropolis of Laramie in the Laramie Valley. You can even trace some of the route of Interstate 80, which is the old railroad going across the southern end of Wyoming. Cheyenne, of course, Casper, Jackson Hole, Wamsutter. There's Wamsutter right there, I think it is. And I don't know if you can see it. You see those two dots right there? You know what that is? That's the happiest couple in Wyoming. There's nothing else around them, is there? And if they weren't happy, there'd only be one dot or none. Well, I like to have fun with things like this. I had this map on my wall in my office, and especially the fourth graders, when they'd come to visit, I'd say, "Can you find your town?" You know, at least we outlined the counties so they could kind of pick that out if they even were geospatially aware of that. But it's fun to do that kind of a thing, and it certainly says a lot about where it's like Garrison Keillor said when he was on campus here for the Prairie Home Companion. You know, he has to have his sponsors of Prairie Home Companion, the duct tape and the Rhubarb Foundation, and he says, and today's program is brought to you by the Wyoming Space Administration. Wyoming, where if everyone were spread evenly across the state, they wouldn't be within eyesight of each other. That kind of space. Well, high altitudes, low multitudes, and great attitudes, certainly. I want to talk about GIS and policy. And I used this map of Ferdinand Hayden on his expedition about the time Wyoming became officially a territory. They were exploring Yellowstone Park. It was a predecessor to when Yellowstone Park was designated as a national park in 1872. Now, in a way, it kind of helps people understand we live in a time when we're kind of taken by what we have, not by what we ought to have. So my perspective about GIS and policy, or technology in general and policy, is how you bring people from where they are to where they ought to be. It's kind of like Wayne Gretzky used to say, I don't skate to where the puck is, I skate to where it's going to be. Let's use that analogy one way or the other. So what does a governor do or any other senior executive? Well, decision-making is part of what I'll talk about today. One of the things the governor is under pressure for all the time, and any other senior executive, it might be a budget director, it might be the head of a company, it might be you individually trying to make a tough decision. And many times that decision will be made on behalf of others. Or you enable others to make their own decisions. And certainly you can represent your organization or your business's policy positions to others, all through information. Each one of these is tagged through information. So here's a crowdsourced question for you. What information would serve you best? I mean, it's the obvious answer. What are you here for? GIS. Okay. The information system, though, more than just the information. So, for me, GIS was a governor's information system. I call it a decision maker's dream. It was a fascinating journey getting there. My journey at Discovery started with Nancy McCann. Anybody know Nancy in the state engineer's office? She was the first one to start using GIS. Lisa Warnicki in the budget office, prior to when I became governor. I think it was about 1986. Lisa got a little bored one day and found this program called GIS. And she talked Nancy into using it. So Wyoming has now experienced, it's been 27 years since Wyoming started using GIS. There's been a little bit of a hiatus, though, I think, since I left office. I'm not sure just all of the details why, but it's back on track. Good to see we have good leadership. Maybe I should ask first, how many people here are from Wyoming? How many from Colorado? A lot less than we're going to be, I know that. Who came the furthest to get here? Any guesses? Laramie, Dalby, Arkansas is not that far. Over in the corner, where are you from? Alaska? Oh, I'm sorry. Boston. That's pretty far out, isn't it? Thank you for being here. Anybody further out than Boston? I saw in the attendance there might be somebody from Maine, but it might have just been a misprint that said me. My journey for GIS was discovering how you could use it. Nancy showed me how you could use GIS on a map to bring up an attribute table and find out what was going on in that particular region. It was on natural resources at the time. And I was fascinated by the way you could click on the map and bring that attribute table up. So I started learning the jargon right away. And I could find out about the hydrology, the water basins. It was originally used to adjudicate the litigation with the tribes over the water rights prior to Wyoming becoming a state. And I was working on the budget at the time, and I said, you know, for health and for education, could I click on a map and find out the demographics of this area and find out how many school-age kids there are? She said, yes, you could. How about the number of doctor's offices close by, if at all? Yes, you could. You could click on the map. And I had several questions like that, and she kept saying, yes, you could. I said, Nancy, why aren't you saying, yes, you can? And she says, because you don't have the data. That was one of my first lessons in discovering about GIS. If you don't have the data, and I would parenthetically say authoritative data, it doesn't matter how good your technology is. You've got to start with something very basic and fundamental. But there's more than that. Government is quite good at process. In fact, we're so good at process in government that we often overlook purpose. And much of my time in office, and since even, has been spent on keeping people's focus on why are you doing this? I used to ask the directors when we reviewed the budget. I said, okay, you're proposing this for what? Well, it's obvious. We need more beds in the youth treatment center in Casper. And I said, for what? Well, to treat the youth. I said, no. Why are you doing this? Why doesn't your budget focus on not having any beds? Well, that was a shock. I said, your goal is to not have to have a youth treatment center. Now, obviously, that's not a realistic goal, but if you don't focus on that, you only focus on the process of, I need more beds. Well, what's the end result? It's a better student, or it's a better adult, something like that. Purpose over process. Importance of senior executives so that they can understand technology and policy. The reason GIS is not extensively used by executives is because they don't understand how it connects, or they're wary of it, they're suspicious of it, they're going to get in trouble, they'll be embarrassed any number of reasons. Expense is usually one of them. But one of the biggest discoveries I made was discovering how much you can benefit from leveraging off of each other. I was going through a process of trying to sort out what our state position would be on a number of natural resource or wildlife issues or energy development. And it was bad enough that our state agencies weren't using the same types of data or processes, let alone the federal government, which is as diverse as there is no federal government. There are many federal governments that we deal with individually. I had to sign 8 separate data sharing agreements with different branches of the federal government, where we only had one agreement with the state. There ought to be one way to sign an agreement with the federal government. There wasn't. So that's part of my journey. And at the time, let's see, how many of you remember which version of ArcView this is? Anybody? 3.2. Well, that's what GIS people saw. That's what I saw. And if you're not seeing it blurry, you are in trouble. In other words, we don't communicate very well with some things that are, in this case, rather hard to explain, but we even do it in our language. I have a slide I'm not using today, but the caption on it says, "What's your language?" We use abbreviations and acronyms, shapefiles and vectors and pixels, whatever. You know, we use a jargon that a lot of people don't relate to. You have to talk to them in their own language. So, the power of place, geography to support decision making, that's the focus of what I have today. The integration of data from different sources, the interrelationships of working together and how one thing affects or could affect something else or somebody, and helping leaders understand priorities. You set priorities by understanding your options and which way you ought to pick and what the benefits or the disadvantages are of each. So it's not about technology, as Christian even talked about, it's about solutions. So, informing conversations, building partnerships, the theme of the conference, I would say informing decisions would be the direction I will take it. Providing simplicity within complexity. Senior executives don't distinguish between what they see in terms of the technology that's helping them visualize something and the underlying data. They don't know how it works typically. When Roger Tomlinson came to me one day and said, "Jim, you're one of 2% of the governors who gets it." And I said, 2%? He said, "Jim, do the math. 50 states, 2%, right? 1. But they want it to work. When you approach a senior executive of any kind, you probably shouldn't try to explain the technology until they're hooked on what it does for them. Otherwise, you get that kind of a look. So, back to about 2007, I was presenting part of the decadal survey, the National Research Council decadal. It's every 10-year update to where we ought to be in earth science and space applications. By the way, my background is space science, engineering. I went from being a rocket scientist to being a farmer to being governor, one of those logical progressions. So I know what STEM is, I think. But there was a presentation made that included some comments about 3 elements that are only loosely connected. And I want to draw them to your attention because I experienced it in office. I experienced it 10 years ago. I experience it yet today. And what are those 3 elements? It's the raw observations that produce information. Okay, I understand that. And the analytics, the synthesis of all of that information using modeling, analysis, and option development to provide for an understanding of that information so that decisions can be engaged. We still only loosely connect these 3 elements. Some people only focus on the data side, or in a way that you have to. I would sound a cautionary note about apps because I'm totally for them, but if they become so isolated that you're not supporting the overall synthesis, then you will miss out in some circumstances. But these 3 need to be well coordinated and connected, and that's still the case today, even in this case 6 years later. So GIS is indeed a platform. Everything you do is somewhere. I've heard the percentage that 80% of what we do has a relationship to geography. I just say flat out, everything you do is somewhere. Even the thoughts you're having right now are here. There's a geography associated with this place. You will remember something about this place, especially if something happens and you spill your soup or whatever. And it affects something else. Everything you do affects somebody or something else. There are intended and unintended benefits and consequences. GIS is compelling because of the ability of visualization to communicate. That's where you get to the people who are the decision makers. If they want to know how you did it, you have to explain what spatial analytics are. Either explain it or you show them again. The apps are really the up-and-coming thing that will help make that point much clearer, and the technology is becoming easier than ever. I just think back to that SWOG conference I did in 2003 and how cumbersome that was to bring the data up and run it on a laptop. Well, first of all, the laptops are a whole lot better. The internet connection was non-existent at the time. I had to pull it off of a CD. There's so many things that are better, and it's just leapfrogging us, so we're not even keeping up. If you look at a curve of how technology is advancing and our ability to use it, we're both on a positive slope, but that curve in technology is outstripping us. We're not effectively using a lot of the new technology. Maps do tell stories, and I want to tell a few of them as we go along here. If you go to the Esri website for ArcGIS.com, I'd point out there's a couple of them on there, the American Futures. James Fallows, or Jim Fallows, he has a personal airplane. He and his wife are flying all over the country. Have any of you heard of him on NPR or in the Atlantic? He's always asking you to nominate towns to go visit. So we nominated, or I did, some others did too, Kemmerer, Lander. I said you ought to talk to the people in Cody and then talk to the people in Powell, or talk to the people in Rock Springs and in Green River. I said you'll get different ideas from those people, even though they're neighbors, right? Every state has those communities that are adjacent and quite different in their thinking, don't they? Well, let me do a real quick one here to kind of illustrate how storytelling with a map can be very powerful. I happen to serve on the board of directors for the Dakota Gasification. It's a Great Plains Gasification plant in North Dakota. And I'm often asked questions about the whole Bakken formation, the shale development, and the question came up, well, how much shale development is there in Wyoming or Colorado or something like that? Well, I think it's National Geographic. Alan Carroll had this put together for them to use. And there are 3 different selections you can make here. The first one talks about where the major plays are. So you have the mighty Marcellus over here in the eastern part of the country, the Bakken up here, the Permian Basin down in Texas, or you can do a state-by-state comparison of where the activity is the greatest. It's cutting off some of the edges on this one, I can tell from the resolution, but then you say, well, where is fracking actually happening with, and it's not populating. That's kind of interesting. Apparently the web's not catching up with it. If you go to this website, it will populate. For instance, up in North Dakota, almost all the fracking is oil. Over here, it's almost all gas. In Texas, it's a mixture. In Wyoming, it's a bit of a mixture. But there is quite a bit going on, even in Wyoming, but we don't hear about it a lot. Well, you do if you hear about some of the problems that may be going on. Now, I'm going to do a real fancy maneuver here. See, I just toggled back to my PowerPoint, didn't I? I had to learn that. Wow. Well, on with this. There's I assembled, with the help of our Denver regional office, quite a portfolio, if you will, of examples of storytellings with a gallery of photos. I want to give a shout out to some of the folks that are here in New Mexico's Community Collaborative, the U-Plan out of Utah, CDOT, Colorado Transportation, Arizona Department of Transportation. Let's see. I was going to go through all these, but I know I don't have time. Let me do a quick one here. Governor Meade and Governor Hickenlooper from Wyoming and Colorado, respectively, want to convert a lot of our transportation fleets over to natural gas. Well, if you're going to do that, you better have a place where you can fill up. To do that, you have to be sure that you know where they are before you run out, unless you have a hybrid vehicle. Well, it turns out that if you live in the Denver metro area, you're not too far from a refueling station. I'm not sure why the web's not bringing these up. Well, here we come. Okay. This is showing real-time traffic patterns on there right now, so you can tell the only slowdowns we have in Wyoming are construction. There's no accidents. What do you mean? These are the natural gas refueling stations. Well, there is a critical traffic accident there. Look at that. But if you want to refuel with your compressed natural gas car, you better stick to Interstate 80 in Wyoming. There isn't any other place. Or stick to the Denver metro area. You'd be pretty well off there. That's just a point to make with something like a map. If you have a governor that wants to do that, you say, okay, but Gov, let me show you what you got. Now, what kind of an infrastructure do we need to put in place? I'm very pleased with the statewide parcel map and the forestry maps that Wyoming has done. So there's any number I could have brought up today. I wish I had time to go through them all because there's some great ones out there. GIS is a value-added thing. I pulled these because I knew there were some people around from different states besides the ones that are hosting here. Pronghorn Habitat Corridor in Montana, groundwater conservation in Texas, temperature change in the Rogue River Basin in Oregon, solar mapping in California, and urban garden with Mayor Becker out in Salt Lake. Is anybody here from Salt Lake? Yes. Okay. Have you met your mayor? And he's a GIS junkie, isn't he? He is. He doesn't know what it's called, but he loves it. Water pressure in Houston, Texas. I think we have a few. Any Texans here? I saw you on the program. Where'd you go? You're down at the brewery already, I bet you. Wind potential in the Great Plains, and I'm not talking about political. Well, anyway, there's quite a number of them out there. So Christian had this up earlier, and I want to point out from my perspective what this means. We still need the professional GIS person. We've got to have those people help us set up those models, the work plans, the things that give us the analysis and the synthesis, the construct through the architecture that we need to arrive at decisions. So that when I take for granted that it's going to be there whenever I pull my iPad out or whatever tablet I'm using, governors, executives of any kind, if they're going to explain something to somebody, they're very apt to pull it up, bring up an image, and start to page through it. You're going to see more and more of that. So if you have executive access, guess what? They expect this to work. And they don't want a reason for why it's not working. And you almost have to second guess what they ought to be looking for. So you have to be preparing over here the ability for them to ask those questions you couldn't possibly have anticipated. Well, you probably did. But you've got quite a number of other people that can access the same thing. We have knowledge workers, public engagement. The fact that it can work anywhere mobile is the biggest up and coming thing for apps. We've all noticed that. What you don't notice here is that when the public is involved, the press is involved. And I used to tell Jimmy Orr, my press guy, I said, Jimmy, I have one criteria for you. I want to know what's going on before the press calls. That's getting harder and harder these days for any executive. Whether you're a business leader or a political leader, if the press is going to call, you better be prepared to say, I know what it is, and here's what I'm doing. Well, that's where something like this ArcGIS online or Cloud GIS, however you want to phrase it, is so important. Understanding human health, another storytelling application, uses the slider map, which is a fascinating thing. How many of you used the Moore, Oklahoma tornado map where you did the slider back and forth? Fascinating, isn't it? Well, this is the same kind of a thing. On the left side, you have counties with no doctor's offices, so that the orange, there's no doctor there. Don't get sick, don't get hurt, or plan it if you're going to. Very high need is the darker orange, very low need is the blues. On the other side, it's counties with no primary care providers in 2006. So the orange says there's no, let alone doctor, there's no primary care, like certified nurse practitioner, physician assistant, whatever. Although even in, let's see, up here in Niobrara County, we have telemedicine. So we do have those kinds of things. But again, for the purposes of telling a story, when you have a slider map like that, you'll engage somebody. So keep that in mind as you prepare things. That's one of the effective tools you can use to get the point across. Cost, Medicare, a federally funded program where spending on Medicare and the highest cost per person, Texas and Florida are among the highest costs. but they don't necessarily have the highest quality care. And when it comes to readmissions, you would think that that would be another place where it would be high cost. But up here where the highest rate of readmissions occurs up in the Northeast, it's not the highest cost area. These are some of the things that you can start to pull out with the, say, regression analysis or other ways of computing it, or even dropping an Excel spreadsheet onto a map, and that becomes a calculation. Members of Congress, immediately you get their attention with something like that. Or if it's Medicaid, which is a state-run program, 37% of all Medicaid households have more than one recipient receiving services, so you start with something like that. And then what Louisiana discovered is proximity to a hospital increases the cost dramatically. One person within a half a mile of the hospital, the average cost is $12,500. If they have to drive 8 miles or more, $6,200. Well, all of a sudden you say, whoa, why is that? If you engage the why question, you've got somebody on your side to support GIS. So even here with 2 people in a household, average cost $5,100, $3,000. It's just one of those things that jumps out at you and you say, well, where is that happening? Well, you map it out. So you might say the newest clinical health data is your street address. It can be the connector for all these other things to pull it together in terms of location, so you can start to look at what are the things that most influence, whether it be lifestyle, utilization, providers, income level, education level. All those are factors in determining the outcomes of health. Let me talk a little bit about GIS for emergency management because of what's been going on, not only in Colorado over the past week, but some of the significant events like Superstorm Sandy. You have GIS and Incident Command. You have emergency operations centers that can be local, state, national, or all three. And the public and how they engage, and what Christian showed you with a map of Longmont, how the public wants to know what's going on. Our youngest daughter and her husband, he's an architecture student at the University of Pennsylvania. They lived in Longmont up until last year. They're eager for information about what's going on in Longmont, even though they don't live there today. ArcGIS or GIS in the cloud is the way to communicate that. And the real-time feeds are an increasingly important element for any of these activities, particularly in emergency management. The most immediate would be weather. Resources, where are they, what do I need versus what do I have, and how quickly can I get them? Mobile devices are more important than ever to communicate that. Real-time traffic, even imagery that can be obtained either with aerial or satellite imagery. In the past, where it took days, weeks, even months to stitch it all together, now it can be done in a matter of hours. So real-time information to feed the media, in this case the Denver Post. Feed the media or they will feed themselves, and it doesn't always look pretty. Public information map that the Denver office stood up in a hurry about shelters, what's happening in different places. All of these have live links. You can look at 2013 U.S. flooding when you go to the ArcGIS online map, and it will bring up a lot of the contributions from various people that have been either tracking, monitoring, managing, responding to the floods. Even things like how do we organize community drop-off points to bring supplies and services to the people who are isolated in, for instance, Estes Park. The only way in and out of Estes Park today is over Trail Ridge Road. It's about a 250-mile trip to go, let's say, to Longmont. Loveland, excuse me, where it normally would only take an hour. It takes about 6. And it's not going to be through Big Thompson Canyon anytime soon. That road is totally a disaster, even worse than the '76 flood. Weld County, Colorado, I think their map is one of the better ones of the ones that have been stood up, but they're all purposeful and meaningful. How many of you have heard of CoCoRaHS, the community collaborative? It's people who report what they're seeing and experiencing with the weather. Each of these dots represents a precipitation total. So the dark blue, there's one in Boulder here that's about 20 inches of rain over the last 7 days. Just because I could do it. I put Wyoming's up, so the Geringer spread is right about out here. We had 6.5 inches. It was all nice and slow and easy. Loved it. We had as much rain in the last 7 days as we had in the last 11 months. But when it comes to crisis, mitigation and planning or preparedness, those are the areas that are most overlooked and the highest importance, whether it be preparation that could quickly pull down an app and pull down data, or even having that infrastructure of information that can be there when you need it so that you can respond. And then, of course, the thing that's almost always overlooked to a great degree is the recovery side, which you need to spend time on. Any crisis management has all of these elements and perhaps some more, but like planning, situational awareness, operational coordination, search and rescue. There's an app for each of these, but there's also an app to pull them all together. And that's the balance that needs to be worked out. There's an app for everything, but it isolates you if you're not careful. You still need the comprehensive enterprise approach. To illustrate that, if you have a crisis that occurs, and the right-hand side of this is the representation of what resources are available to monitor, then the crisis occurs. And all crises are local crises. It might be 72 hours before you can get enough resources in to handle it. For the time being, you ask for mutual aid, either within the community or for towns in the vicinity. It might even be across a state line, but mutual aid capability. If it exceeds the local capability, then there's a request for assistance that goes up to the state. You engage them. If the governor needs to, he can call a state of emergency or a disaster situation, declare it. By then, you're probably engaging the National Guard at the governor's call. If it happens to exceed, and I would point out that 80 to 85% of all crises are at and below that level. We all talk about the ones that have occurred on a major scale like Sandy, but this is where the heart of it is. This is where you learn the most. This is where you find out what you don't have for preparedness and need it. If it exceeds that, then you have federal support through the NRF. It's not NERF, it's the National Response Framework. 10% of emergencies fall in that category, and if they're beyond that, DSCA stands for Defense Support of Civil Authorities through NORTHCOM. Now, you can imagine with all these entities involved, if they're not using some sort of a common approach, common data, even though they have individual elements, each emergency support function has its own designated category of information they need, it still needs to be stitched together. And that common operating picture, the shared situational awareness, does not flow easily. We still do not have standardization between the Guard in a given state and the Emergency Operations Center in the same state. They have different data, they have different software in many cases, because the funding for the Guard typically comes from the feds, not from the local. It's just another element of how there needs to be coordination that makes it go on. So key metrics for decision support, you have to be able to discover the data that you are pretty sure you need, accurate or authoritative, scaled for the decision. And remember, an online data viewer is not a decision support tool by itself. It only is a beginning to draw you in, to make data meaningful, make it relevant. Storytelling, decision-making is an iterative process. It does not occur once. And collaboration is key. I would never overstress that. So from spatial data to decisions, the integration, creating the visualization, telling the story so the decision maker can engage individually or as a senior executive. And once that decision is made, that person has to justify it or explain it, and storytelling comes to bear right away to be able to do that. So what do you have to communicate and to whom? It starts with measuring and managing data, providing for the analytics. That's the professional GIS person over here that puts things in the cloud that the others start to draw on for visualization, planning. Within that design and planning stage, there are the options. Don't tell me what I need to have as a single choice. Tell me what my options are. Even though there's good and bad choices in there, I need to weigh them. Give me the ability to do that so that when the person acts, then they can evaluate, was that decision correct, or have the circumstances changed based on real-time data feeds. Christian mentioned the executive dashboard with the key performance indicators. You can go to github.com/Esri/executive dashboard and pull up the dashboard for any level, not just government, any level of person that likes to have an idea of what, like if a governor has 8 important things that he or she would like to accomplish, that governor could have those on the dashboard and then click the status, red, yellow, green, whatever it might be. So the idea is to integrate all the geospatial information that you can, but have the ability to react quickly, which is what apps gives you the ability to do through the web. Quickly now, if you had 10 minutes at the top, what would you talk about? I've had a number of people come to me and say, do you know my governor? And I say, yeah, I can, or I can get to know that person. Why? Well, I want to talk to them about GIS. I said, well, I have some advice. Don't. And it's not just governor, it could be a budget director, a business leader. Find out what issue is hot on their plate today, what the problem is they're trying to solve. Come up with a proof of concept or a demo of some kind, an app that could say, look at this. That's the storytelling map to engage. When you do that and provide an example, all of a sudden, if the person responds with, what if, they're hooked. Because what they're saying is, what if I could do this? Can you do that? And you explain through GIS, yes, you could. Do I make my point? You better be prepared to say, yes, you can. So in the West, with all the conflicting and competing activities that are going on for oil and gas, land use planning, wildlife management, you could say, here's the issue, those issues that compete. The problem is we have policy makers at odds on competing alternatives, even dueling sciences that you have to resolve. The solution is develop some assessment tools where people gather together and work out how they can all achieve their goals, or at least the majority of their goals, through GIS for data integration, analysis, not just a map, assessment of decisions. So it becomes a system for collaboration and action. And Wyoming's density and disturbance calculation tool for sage-grouse management is an example of that. So we're all here to change. How we organize and reason, that's accelerating the pace. How we collaborate, there's not enough of that going on. How we communicate, the conversations that we're having as the theme of this conference, communicating through a geospatial language. And I highlighted on here knowledge and persuasion. There's an old saying, I know and am persuaded. It's one thing to have knowledge, but knowledge is just a presentation of information until you're persuaded that action is needed, and here's my actionable step that I can take. Be prepared to enable the person to persuade, and storytelling is a key part of that. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you very much.